Welcome to this video lecture, Free Speech, Rhetoric, and Democracy, a brief intersectional history. In this video, we will explore the historic roots of democracy and discuss how this form of government arose alongside the study of rhetoric and the right of free speech. Free speech is a highly valued, though hotly contested right in American society, politics, and legal systems, and one that many citizens take for granted. Free speech is one of the rights declared in the First Amendment to the Constitution, along with freedom of religion, freedom of the press, and the right to assemble and petition the government for a redress of grievances. But where did this idea come from? And how does it historically intersect with ideas such as democracy and rhetoric? As with many of our embedded institutions and practices, free speech, democracy, and rhetoric all trace their roots back to ancient Athens in the 4th and 5th century BCE. Ideas such as isonomia, the equality of all citizens before the law, isagoria, the ability of all citizens to have the equal right to speak, and Parrhesia, the right or duty to speak boldly and frankly, especially in risky situations, arose contemporaneously with the concepts of democracy and rhetoric in the 4th and 5th centuries BCE Athens. Figures such as Pericles, Diogenes, and Socrates were well known as Parrhesiastes, people who spoke out, often against the wishes of the crowd, in order to express what they believed to be right, true, and in the best interest of the democratic polis of Athens. Pericles was perhaps the most famous leader and champion of Athenian democracy and is responsible for instigating many of the building projects that we still associate with classical Athens today. In addition, he was one of the most accomplished rhetoricians of the ancient world. Largely due to his rhetorical skill, he was annually re-elected by the people of Athens for 40 years, beginning in the mid-5th century BCE. Socrates, who was born approximately 30 years after Pericles, is known as a man who insisted upon seeking and telling the truth, even to the extent that it cost him his life, which is another marker of a Parrhesiastes. Diogenes, who was a contemporary of Plato and Aristotle, and whose teacher was a close friend of Socrates, was the father of the Cynic school of philosophy. For Diogenes, there was no distinction between the private and the public. Nothing was hidden, and all living occurred in the open. Diogenes famously heckled Plato in public, and once reportedly insulted Alexander the Great, despite living as a vagrant in the streets of Athens. All of these figures provide early examples of Parrhesia, a particular type of risky free speech that was considered an imperative part of Athenian democracy at its inception in ancient Athens. Early theories of rhetoric arose around the same time by thinkers such as Plato, Aristotle, and Isocrates, all of whom addressed ideas of free speech to some degree in their writing. While it may seem difficult for us to imagine here, centuries later, democracy was actually a very contested idea at the time. Plato, for instance, feared mob rule and mistrusted the practice of rhetorical skill, especially when writing about the sophists, who were traveling teachers and taught rhetoric, among other subjects, in Athens and other cities. Isocrates, considered the most influential rhetorician of his time, warned of the dangers of flattery, advocating instead for leaders like the past Pericles, who had told the crowd what it needed to hear rather than only what it wanted to hear. And of course, Aristotle produced his famous work on rhetoric, which, if read alongside Nicomachean Ethics and Politics, shows how he envisioned the interrelated workings of these three areas. In these ways, rhetoricians and orators were charged with upholding the good of the polis through the practice of free speech, though they were also chastised for not doing so effectively, and instead falling prey to flattery for the purpose of personal gain and political power. All of these thinkers were harsh critics of those who spoke only for their own gain and instead advocated for ethical uses of words and power. Athenian democracy eventually fell with the invasion of Philip of Macedon in 322 BCE, and democracy itself was not practiced again for centuries. However, in the Middle Ages, many Greek and Roman texts were rediscovered after having been lost after the fall of the Roman Empire. The works of rhetoricians and philosophers such as Plato, Aristotle, and Cicero resurfaced and joined to create the canon of thought, education, rhetoric, and politics that were handed down through Western history to influence the social and political systems of Europe and eventually America. While the history of free speech, democracy, and rhetoric is interesting, how does this all affect us today? More than ever, free speech continues to be contested. What constitutes free speech versus hate speech? What about freedom of the press? Do we have a right to speak out even in the face of national security or ideas that are dangerous to the state? What about hate speech? or speech that deeply offends or hurts others? Should that be protected? These and other issues continue to be debated today and are the subject of countless rhetorical arguments meant to persuade audiences to particular ways of thinking and to adhering to certain ideologies. These debates are important as they constitute and decide what speech we will protect going forward and what rights we will continue to uphold as a society. Today, too, we continue to see risky, courageous acts of speaking out against injustice and unfair balances of power. Just as in the time of ancient Athens, these Parrhesiastic rhetors are controversial. One person's hero can be another person's traitor, and yet they serve an important function within a democratic society, or a world which attempts to become more democratic. By speaking out, even amidst risk, these people invoke the age-old practice of Parrhesia, speaking truth to power, which has intersected with rhetoric and democracy since their inception centuries ago at the foundation of Western thought. Thank you for your time. I hope that you will think more about these topics and examine for yourself the ways that free speech, democracy, and rhetoric work together, and how the ethical uses of rhetoric might serve to protect and expand democratic practices and the right to speak freely for our future.